This is the first in a series of several tapings which will extend over several months and several hours with President Nixon. In the subsequent sessions, we'll talk about some of the domestic and foreign leaders that he's known and get his insights into their lives and careers. In this first session, we will begin at the beginning with his early life and political career. To begin at the beginning, do you have a first conscious memory?
Well, curiously enough, my first memory is of running. I recall when I was about 3 or 3.5 years of age that my mother was driving a horse and buggy, a very fast horse. She was carrying my younger brother, who was then 1, Don, on her lap, and a neighbor girl who was about 12 was holding me. The buggy turned a corner and the horse took off, and the neighbor girl dropped me. I fell out of the buggy. I got a crease in my scalp, and I jumped up afterwards, and I was running, trying to catch up because I was afraid to be left behind. Incidentally, I had a wound from that for many years thereafter. I wasn't able to part my hair on the left due to the fact that I had about 15 stitches down that scalp.
Didn't you, in the 1946 campaign, weren't you going to mention that in a biography, and didn't your press secretary suggest that you're not?
Oh yes, the suggestion was made that, oh, you can't tell them that you got hit in the head by a carriage or wheel, because they'll think that that's why there's something wrong with your head. And so I haven't told that story too often lately.
Actually, that did work against Wayne Morse, didn't it?
Yes, Joe McCarthy, I thought one of his attacks that I thought was out of line. They weren't all out of line, but this one certainly was. He said the trouble with Wayne Morse is that he got kicked in the head by a horse sometime, and that was why he was a little nutty.
In your memoirs, you wrote about your parents that whoever said that opposites attract was describing the two of them. We have some photographs of your mother here. The first one, I think, was taken as a girl in Indiana, and the next one is a group portrait, very characteristic of the times, taken in Whittier when she was a teenager. And the last one, I think, is also of her at that same time. It's remarkable how much she looks like Julie, I think, in these pictures.
Yes, she does.
What do you think of, what characteristics do you think of when you think of your mother in that period, in the early years?
Well, I have said that she was quite a remarkable woman, and I guess most of us say that about our mothers and really feel it, and each of them is, each in a different way. But I think in her case, those characteristics that stand out among many are first, great strength, great kindness. She had a soft manner about her in her speech and the way she acted. I've never recalled a time when she raised her voice in anger about anything, but she could be very, very convincing in speaking very, very softly about something with which she disapproved. And in addition to that, she had a great capacity for love, which extended far beyond her husband, whom she loved dearly, her children, for whom she would do anything. That capacity for love seemed to emanate to everybody, to her sisters, to those she cared for when my brother was sick. And all of this made her develop characteristics that some friends used to say, they used to tell me, you know, Hannah, which was her name, is a Quaker saint.
I think you wrote somewhere that were she alive today, that she wouldn't support the strong law and order ethic that underlies a lot of contemporary politics.
She had too much compassion to do that. That's true. As a matter of fact, I recall an incident at the time that we had the grocery store, and we were working there, and one of our customers, whose children were good friends of mine in school and of Don's, my brother's, she found had been shoplifting. And under the circumstances, the sheriff came by and she mentioned it to him, and he said, well, you'll have to report this. And she says, I won't do it because it will be terrible for her and for her children. So one day, when the lady came in, and what she picked up, incidentally, was so small, it was just a kleptomaniac problem because they weren't poor, not by the standards of those days. She had a pound of butter and and some eggs and some cheese, and she had slipped it into the bag, and she took it out and hadn't checked it through. My mother followed her out to the car, and she said, I wonder if you would like to pay me for those things. The woman burst into tears and said, please don't tell my husband, he would kill me and it will ruin with the boys. And my mother said, don't be concerned. She says, how much do you think you've taken? And the woman estimated about $75 worth. She says, I'll pay you back. And for the next year, she paid her back at $5 a month until it was all paid. The boys never heard about it, her husband didn't hear about it, and of course she didn't continue to come in the store. But that was the way my mother would do it. She would never enforce the law if some other way you could work the thing out.
Excuse me, gentlemen, could we fix the mic cable just for a second? Keep rolling tape. Right? Just go in and fix that one mic. There's tension on it from the back of the tie. Tuck it in the belt, remove it and tuck it, and that'll work.
How's that look?
Close up, please. That's perfect. It'll hold. That's good. That's perfect. That's good. You just go straight to it. Okay, Frank. We'll come out to camera 2 and keep right on going. Stand by.
Your mother was a very community-minded woman, but she was also an intensely private woman, even, I think, in her praying.
Oh, she certainly was. She never believed in wearing religion on her sleeve. We went to church a great deal, I must say, and she insisted on that, as did my father. I recall, for example, we used to go to Sunday school and church in the morning on Sunday, and Christian Endeavor at church in the evening, and then even go to prayer meeting sometimes on the middle of the week. But on the other hand, when it came to praying, first, we always had silent grace at table, except on occasion she would have each of the boys repeat a verse so that she could be sure that we were learning our verses. And when she prayed, she would often go, as the Bible indicates you should, into the closet and close the door. She never prayed publicly.
Your father, many of the people who remember him think of his most prominent characteristic as his temper. And I gather that even in the store you had to sort of insulate him from the customers.
Yeah. Well, he was argumentative, he was combative, he was competitive. He was a character, there's no question about that. The very opposite of my mother in that respect. And she often had to soothe ruffled feathers of customers who came in, because my father would pick arguments with them. He loved to talk about politics or anything for that matter. And she sometimes, when people would come into the store that he was having a running argument with, one or the others of us would rush up to wait on that customer to assure my dad didn't get to him. And that's the way we handled him. But on the other hand, don't get the wrong impression about him as a real man. He too was remarkable in his way. You know, my mother understood him. My mother was quite well educated for those times. She was proficient in Greek and in Latin and in German. She also knew something about the piano, helped me a bit in that respect. She'd been to college for 2 years and then got married before finishing. My father only went through the 6th grade.
We have a photograph here of him taken, I think, shortly after he moved to Whittier. He'd had a lot of interesting jobs before that, hadn't he?
Well, as a matter of fact, he went only to the 6th grade, not because he was dumb, but because his mother died of tuberculosis when he was about 8 or 9 years old. And from then on, he was shunted from family to family, and he worked in every kind of a job. He worked as a streetcar motorman in Columbus, Ohio. He worked in the wheat fields in Colorado. He worked in the oil fields. He was an excellent carpenter. As a matter of fact, he built the house that I was born in. He was the greatest fireplace maker that Yorba Linda or anybody ever had. He used to make fireplaces for all the people when they were building fireplaces in their houses. And then, of course, he was one who was always ahead of the times. He bought the first tractor in Yorba Linda, and then he contracted out to all the others to do work with tractors when others were still using horses. He was one who built the first service station and store between Whittier and La Habra when other people didn't see that this was a real moneymaker. So as I say, I think that the boys, all of us, inherited from our mother, certainly, some of her fine characteristics, but we also inherited from our father some of his characteristics. In my case, I guess I'd have to credit him with the competitive spirit, with the combativeness, etc.
Didn't he believe strongly in work, the importance of work above all else, even to the exclusion of labor-saving devices?
Oh, yes. Oh, you can say that again. Not only did he believe in work, but he had worked all his life himself. That didn't mean that he didn't have concern about people that couldn't get a job. You know, his bark was much louder than his bite. While the tramps would come along, as they did in those days, particularly of the Depression, my mother always fed him. He always insisted they do a little work. His feeling was that if you worked hard, you could get a job and you could keep it. And as far as labor-saving devices were concerned, you see in those years of the Depression, we weren't too aware of it, of course, but I can remember very well, he said the way to get more jobs is not to have all these machines that dig ditches. Get people out there to dig those ditches. That's the way to have jobs. So he would have done very well in India, where they also opposed labor-saving devices.
Did they have discussions later on about moving back to Pennsylvania, where I think your mother had fond memories of a farm and he had very realistic...
Oh, they had discussions not only of moving to Pennsylvania, but just of going to a farm generally. My mother had the most pleasant, almost mystical memories of her growing up on a farm in Indiana. And she remembered all the nice things about it, the harvest time and the springtime and the snow and so forth, and she used to talk about it and dream about it and so forth because she was 12 years old before she left Indiana. And so she used to say to my dad, says, we got to go to a farm. And I remember one time we drove clear up to Oregon looking for a farm. It wasn't just Pennsylvania, that's where they eventually bought one after I came to Washington. But she wanted to go to a farm. And my dad used to say, Hannah, forget it. He says, I've been on a farm. I know what it is. And then he would describe the hard work of a farm, the back-breaking work, having to shovel manure, take care of the horses, et cetera, having to run the risk, of course, of bad weather destroying a crop, scratching and biting around. He says, I don't want any part of a farm. But eventually, of course, she won, as she usually did. They did go to a farm. Just as she won on the matter of religion. My mother was a Quaker, as I think everybody is quite aware. I referred to her as a Quaker saint. And my father was a Methodist, but when they married, they compromised. They both became Quakers, of course.
When they went to the farm, didn't he disconcert visitors by the way he named some of the animals?
Well, yes. He would name the animals for certain political people that he didn't like. And under the circumstances, some of them didn't particularly appreciate that. I think one was named for Truman, and another one for Stassen, and people like that, as I recall.
This is we have a photograph here of the house that he built that you were born in. I think at one point in the 1950 campaign, you went back there and commented about how small, coming back to it, how small it seemed to you after not having been there for a while. What are your memories of early life in that house?
It didn't seem small then. I remember particularly Christmas time. I remember you see the fireplace there, which the old man built, and it was a marvelous fireplace, threw out a lot of heat. And I remember, of course, we believed in Santa Claus, and I remember coming down those stairs. We used to sleep upstairs. My mother and father's room was over on this side of the house, the bedroom in which I was born, as I was born in that house. And but we'd come down and we'd sit around the fireplace, and it seemed like it was a very big room and a very nice room. I guess what I remember most about that house, though, was talking. There was no television then. There was no radio, but did we talk evening after evening? And that's one of the reasons, for example, that I think I got an interest in politics very, very early, because I can even remember my father berating my mother for having voted for Woodrow Wilson in 1916. Now, this was much later, about 1920, 21, when he then was saying, now look, you vote the straight Republican ticket. And yet in 1924, I remember very well that he didn't vote the straight Republican ticket. He voted for La Follette because he thought La Follette was against the trusts, La Follette was against big business, La Follette was for the little man, and he thought that Coolidge was too much for the big man. And so it was all of his talk of voting the straight party line. He was very independent in his own way.
Given that opposites do attract, what do you think it was that your mother saw in your father? They met, I think, at a Valentine's dance, and within 3 months were married, and yet the differences must have been tremendous at the time. She came from a very refined, restrained, rooted Quaker family, and he was sort of a freewheeling, rambling kind of...
Diamond in the rough.
Yeah.
Right. I think she saw in him, first, that he was a very handsome fellow, vigorous, handsome. He had a lot of magnetism, and I think that affected her to an extent. And I think another thing that affected her was the fact that she felt that he really needed her. I mean, my mother had such a heart, you know, and I think when she realized that this boy hadn't had a mother, and incidentally hated his stepmother, even though she lived right near us near Yorba Linda, but he didn't like her at all, and he had never really had much of a chance in life. And he wanted desperately. I remember my father always said to each of us, you got to go on to school. He says, I didn't finish. And he insisted we go on. He wanted us to have a better time than he had.
Why didn't he like his stepmother?
I think it's because stepmothers are stepmothers. She was somewhat of a disciplinarian. I knew her. She was married, as a matter of fact, to Doc Marshburn, who was the father of Oscar Marshburn, who married my mother's youngest sister. And quite an interesting coincidence. I met her, I knew her, I liked her. But she was a very strong personality. And I just think that my father, he was probably independent. It probably as much fault his as hers.
Was it difficult growing up around a man with a voluble temper?
To an extent, yes. But and if it had not been for my mother, it would have been very difficult. But insofar as his temper was concerned, I should make it clear that he was not a violent man. I remember, for example, to show you what a soft touch he was, we used to love to go barefoot. And in the winter, of course, we couldn't do that. But just as soon as spring came, we would go to my mother and say, can we go barefoot now? Because in school you wore shoes if you had them, which we did. And she'd say, go ask your father. And he'd say, go ask your mother. But finally, it was always the old man that gave in. He said, okay, go barefoot. As a matter of fact, well, you're not supposed to, I suppose, they say don't, you fail to use the rod, you spoil the child. But he was not one who could use that physical punishment as much as others did. And I can't recall it too much.
We have some early family photographs of you in a chair, and some other ones with. Didn't your father cut your hair? That's a very.
Oh yes, and boy, we hated
the
that.
bowl
Yeah.
look brings that.
My
question to
father,
mind.
you know, as I said, he could do it all, and he was the barber too. And he not only cut our hair, of all when we were growing up, but he insisted on continuing to do it even after there was a barber in town. And I remember, I think I got my first what we call store haircut when I was about 8, 9 years old, and I was glad to have it because I remember sometimes my father had clippers that sometimes they pulled, and getting a haircut was agony, and I just hated to do it. But he was a good barber. It was a pretty good job he did, I thought, when I looked at those pictures.
We have a couple of other ones, I think. You had, there is a young Nixon amidst the pumpkins. I think that's you below and Harold up above.
That's exactly who it is, yes. I don't think I've seen that picture before.
Now, the psychologists would say that the pumpkin papers were prefigured in this photograph.
Oh yes, they'd figure some way to, the psychohistorians would figure that had to have something to do with Whittaker Chambers hiding the microfilm in pumpkins. 40 years later.
And this is you, and I guess that's Arthur on your mother's
Don.
lap there.
That's Don.
Don.
Don, and I'm there 3.5. Don was 2 years younger than I. That's right.
She named, except for Don, who was named after your father, Francis Donald, didn't she name you, she had historical?
Always that, yeah. She had an historical sense, and we were all named after the early kings of England, of course. Harold, obviously, Richard, Edward, and Arthur.
It was a remarkable family. I think Jessamine West has written about some of the early mill houses in The Friendly Persuasion. This is a photograph of your great-grandmother Elizabeth Millhouse.
Who is also Jessamine West's great-grandmother.
Ah.
They're the same.
And wasn't she the
See,
model?
we're cousins. And as a matter of fact, she was the model for the mother in Friendly Persuasion, playing opposite Gary Cooper, you know, in that marvelous movie, which incidentally was Mamie Eisenhower's favorite movie. She saw it, she told me, a half a dozen times.
Wasn't Elizabeth Millhouse was a Quaker preacher?
Remarkably capable, apparently, and very famous. She was a preacher in the Indiana, Iowa area. Now, by a Quaker preacher, I should say that the Quakers didn't have preachers in the real sense, but she was one that had the Spirit, as the Quakers would say it. She was moved by the Spirit, and she would go from place to Quaker meeting, and she would speak, and she was in much demand. I think one of the favorite family stories, and this is not apocryphal because I've heard it from all the people who knew her, and I knew her too, because she lived to be 94, and I knew her, and of course admired her too. Anyway, she was scheduled to go on a long train trip in order to do a meeting in another city. And because in those days the food on the train was expensive and this and that and the other thing, she made some sardine sandwiches up, and she put them in her cape, one of these long capes that she rode on the train, and she got very busy preparing her remarks for when she got to the meeting, that she didn't get to eat the sardine sandwiches. So she went into right in time to give her sermon, and her theme that day was the parable of the loaves and the fishes, and she was very apparently expressive in her gestures. And when she came to the loaves and the fishes, she had her hands in her cape. She threw out her hands, and out came the sardines, and the sang over the people right in the front row. So it was a very graphic illustration. Before I guess some of these modern television preachers would love to have had that one. And incidentally, her eyesight was amazing. My dad used to have his socks. They get holes in them. And she insisted that she wanted to darn the socks, and she could do it. She didn't have to wear glasses to do so.
This is a photograph of your grandmother Millhouse, who had a very important effect on your life. And
you see, the great-grandmother was on my grandfather's side. This is on my grandmother's side, what I would say. And Elmira was her name. Everybody called her Aunt Allie. And she too lived to be very old, 93, 94. I have many vivid memories of her. She was a poet, not a great poet, but she used to write me and my brothers and all of her children and so forth on birthdays, often in rhyme. And she took a special interest in me. I don't know why, but she did. And I recall she'd always give me very special presents when I graduated. One, for example, I recall when I graduated from the 8th grade, she gave me a picture of Lincoln, and beneath it was the famous Longfellow poem, "Lives of great men oft remind us we can make our life that kind, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sand of time." Incidentally, I took off from that because I was the president of the 8th grade graduating class, and so I gave the class history. I wrote the class history in poetry myself, and I concluded it with these lines: "Lives of great men oft remind us we can make our life that sort, and departing leave behind us footprints on the tennis court." Well, some of them didn't appreciate it, but I thought it was a pretty good line. In any event, my grandmother then, when I graduated from high school, gave me a biography of Gandhi. Of course, she being a Quaker, that meant a great deal to her and to me, and I read it from cover to cover several times. I graduated from college, she gave me a leather-bound Bible, and when I graduated from law school, she gave me a marvelous illustrated Life of Christ, which Billy Graham says is one of the great classics. But more than that, I think what she meant to me was the fact that her manner and everything. Oh, I perhaps should mention that it wasn't just me, but she was equally good and generous to all of her children. You have to understand, she was the mother of 7 herself, and there were 2 others. I mean, she was a mother of 6, and there were two others. And in addition to that, there were all kinds of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and all were treated equally. And I remember Christmas time. She would be there. We'd always have what we called a family reunion. And incidentally, the old man didn't like to go to those reunions. You know, he was pretty cantankerous about it, but he loved my grandmother, and she liked him because she understood him just like my mother did. And at Christmas, she would sit there in a lovely velvet dress, I remember, around the Christmas tree, and all of us, she gave, incidentally, to us on Christmas, every Christmas, $5 in little envelopes that were on the tree. And of course, that was a fortune in those days. But anyway, she'd sit there, and we had presents for her. They were nothing things, but she'd make over those presents as if it's just what I wanted. Another thing that was interesting about her, you know, my grandmother always addressed us with what we Quakers call the plain speech. She wouldn't say, "Are you going?" She says, "Richard, is thee going, and is this thine?" She did that with everybody that she met, including people that were strangers. And then in the next generation, my mother, with her sisters, always broke into the plain speech whenever they were talking on telephone. It was always very interesting to me to hear them say, she'd say, "Is Martha or Jane or whatever sister it might be calling, I just thought that this thing of thine was very good," and so forth and so on. And then we got down to our generation, and we didn't use it at all. My mother, for example, never used the plain speech with her children. She did with her sisters, and of course my grandmother with everybody. So it seems like a nothing thing at the moment, but it is a pleasant memory now. Another thing I remember about her, though, you know, she was a very devout pacifist, as a good Quaker should be. But I remember often on a Sunday, my grandmother would ask one of us to drive her to Sawtell, which was the Veterans Hospital way across town. It took about an hour to get there. And she would pack some goodies, cakes that she had baked and cookies and that sort of thing. And she'd spend a couple of hours over there going among the wounded soldiers and so forth. This, of course, was after World War I. And reading to them, writing letters for them, and so forth. While she hated war, she loved those that had to fight it.
Wasn't it her use of plain speech, or the use of plain speech amongst herself and and her and the sisters that convinced you that many years later, during the Hiss case, that Chambers was telling the truth about part of his memories of Hiss?
One of the factors that did, yes. See, the difficulty in the Hiss Chambers case, when we were at that stage, when we were attempting to decide or prove that Hiss knew Chambers after Hiss denied having known him, was that although we had had from Chambers, I prepared an enormous number of questions to Chambers about everything he knew about Hiss, and he was able to say, for example, describe all of the houses that Hiss had lived in, describe the cars, describe his family, describe his wife's flushing when she was excited, and so forth and so on. But the problem was whether or not Chambers could have known all those things and didn't know them independently. The problem was whether or not Chambers could not have studied Hiss's life and then told us about all those things without ever having known Hiss himself. But I recall one time when I went up to Chambers' farm, we were sitting out on the porch looking over his cattle, which he was very proud of, and Mrs. Chambers, it was a very hot day, brought us out some cold lemonade, and as we were drinking it, I asked him to tell me a little more about the background of Mrs. Hiss. And I happened to mention in passing that I was a Quaker. And he said, and he snapped his fingers, he said, Priscilla was a Quaker. Let me say that again. I remember that when I went up to see him, I mentioned that I was a Quaker. And he said, you know, Priscilla Hiss was a Quaker too. And then he snapped his finger and he says, that reminds me of something. She always used the plain speech, or she quite often used the plain speech when she was talking to Alger. And I thought for a moment that the way he said it, I mean, others could have told him that Mrs. Hiss, being a Quaker, sometimes used the plain speech when she's talking to her husband. But the way he said it so spontaneously, said he's talking about a man he knows, not somebody he's read about.
The Quaker families at that time, too, were sort of extended families in that when you, for example, when you wanted to take music lessons or when your parents wanted to encourage your music lessons, you went and stayed with Aunt Jane
Yes.
in Lindsay.
Well, let me say that when you speak of an extended family, you're right. First, it was a very big family. And my first music lessons actually were from my Uncle Griffith, who was my mother's half-brother. He was the oldest and a marvelous man. And I took lessons from him about the time I was 7 years of age. As a matter of fact, I've got to do a little puffing here. My mother recalls that I played by ear, which I did before I ever took any lessons. And I remember the first song I ever played was Joy to the World, the Christmas Carol. Well, after she'd heard a little of that playing by ear, I could pick out tunes and so forth. She had Uncle Griffith give me lessons, and piano and violin. And then when I was in the 7th grade, Aunt Jane, who was a very accomplished pianist, as was Uncle Griffith, came down to the Christmas Eve reunion, as a matter of fact, and she heard me play a couple of pieces. She says, Richard, you have got to come up and have lessons. She spoke to my father and mother about it, and so I went back with her and Alden and Sheldon, her children, and my Uncle Harold, her husband. It was a great trip going back. I remember it particularly for a rather curious reason. It's the first time I ever saw snow. At least I had seen it on the mountains before from Yorba Linda, because that was a marvelous place in those days. Before the days of smog, you could see the snow in the wintertime on Mount Baldy, and you could see Catalina if you got up on one of the little hills off in the distance 25 miles away. But I had never been in snow. And we got out of the cars. We went over to Tehachapi, and I played in the snow there, and I was really excited. And I said, golly, this is fun. And Alden said to me, rather sternly, he says, we don't say golly at our house. Now, I thought I'd been raised rather strictly, but when I got up there to the Beesons, believe me, it was strict. But she was a marvelous teacher, and I became quite advanced for that age. I could play Sending's Rustle of Spring, which of course everybody learns to play who has any advancement at all, Grieg, a few other things.
Weren't you, I've read somewhere that you were sort of the class cut-up there, and that you and one of your cousins did something with a clove of garlic that got you in trouble.
I don't think I recall that.
I read that you ate a clove before going into the class, and then breathed on the girl students next to you.
Well, I think I know what you mean now. It was very unpleasant, and incidentally, I really not liked garlic ever since then. As a matter of fact, a little of it goes a long way.
Your Aunt Beth was one of your favorites.
Yes. Aunt Beth was younger than my mother, and she had a marvelous voice. I remember her and my singing, for example, in church, a beautiful soprano voice. And she was so full of life and so very pretty and always jolly and fun, always cutting up and so forth and so on. And I'll never forget that one of the most moving moments was, and a very sad moment, was when she got cancer. And I remember that she went to all these quacks, and one time went clear back in the middle of the country where somebody had some scheme where you burn it off. And then she came back, and then finally she died. And she was so young and so pretty and so vibrant and left 3 children. It was a difficult time for us. Of course, let me say, all of my aunts were something too. I mean, my Aunt Edith, which was the oldest one, my mother's oldest sister, she was married to Uncle Tim Timberlake, and he was an excellent, what do you call it, the people that deal with insects? And anyway, entomologists. And they spent, which meant a great deal to us, they spent some time in Hawaii, and then came back, and then they were at Riverside. And I remember at the family reunions, Uncle Tim would come there, and he'd always bring along one of these nets, and he'd go out and collect butterflies and insects, and everybody thought he was a little strange. And in our family, too, if I may digress, they thought he was a little strange for another reason, because he smoked a pipe. Nobody else smoked. You see, in those days, my mother didn't drink or smoke, neither did my father, and none of my relatives that I know of, except Uncle Tim, he smoked the pipe. One year, incidentally, I did do something which my mother really didn't disapprove of. We had Prince Albert tobacco there in the store, and I got some. We would sell it, although we wouldn't use it ourselves, and I got a big can of it and gave it to him for Christmas. But they always made him smoke his pipe outside. But he got what was considered a handsome salary of $300 a month over at the University of California Experiment Station. And my Aunt Edith was so generous. When I went to Duke to law school, they didn't have any money. Every Christmas she sent me $25, even though she had 3 children. And I thought that was generous. My Aunt Martha, who was the one between Edith and my mother, was a nurse, a registered nurse, and after all of her children were grown, continued to nurse between the time she was 70 and 85 years of age. Enormously competent. My aunt, I mentioned a moment ago, Aunt Olive, who's still living. You've met her, gentle and kind and so forth. She and Uncle Oscar, at 75 years of age, while I was president, went way out to Kenya for a year with the American Friends Service Committee to work in a hospital out there. Incidentally, I had just thought of one thing about my Uncle Oscar. He, of course, being a Quaker, was a conscientious objector in World War I. But it wasn't because he was afraid, because he volunteered to go over with the American Friends Service Committee. And so he went over to France. And I remember he brought back with him a collection of shells and grenades and so forth. And I remember that it was in the bedroom that they had there at the big house, because they were living with my grandmother. And my brothers and my cousins and I, we used to just revel in going into the bedrooms and taking up these shells, being informed, of course, that they were no longer dangerous. But that was as close as we came to World War I.
Excuse me, gentlemen, 1 second. We can go in and touch up just a hair, straighten coats, and keep rolling tape. Everything's going fine.
Excuse me, Mr. President, if you could just pull your shirt down, it's starting to, that's it, and I'll catch your coat.
I'm going to ask you again about music lessons.
Oh, yeah,
We've got a
fine.
film,
Sure,
a film
sure,
of your mother
sure.
talking.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Frank, are we going to sound on tape next?
Yes.
Okay, we are. We'll come out to you on camera 1.
Not right away, but in a minute.
Okay, fine. You just carry on, but that's the next item, right?
Yes.
All right, sir.
Stand by studio. Keep rolling tape. Come out in 10. Cancel that order.
Got it? Okay.
Coming out in 10. Stand by.
They were quite a bunch of characters, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
Martha and all.
Eisenhower used to urge you to refer more to God in your speeches, and yet you resisted. Why did you do that, and how do you think of what is the legacy to you of your early Quaker family background and training?
Well, first I would say that Eisenhower mentioned to me, I don't think from a crass political standpoint, but simply because he knew that I had a religious background, as he did. He felt that I should refer to God in my speeches, as he did, because it was good politically and also it was honest. The difficulty was that it goes clear back to my mother's attitude and my father's too, that while we, during those early years, and they through all their years, were churchgoers regularly and tithe and all the things you do if you're a good Christian and so forth, we never wore it on the sleeve. And consequently, I just always felt embarrassed, frankly, uneasy. Whenever I would say, use God, the word God in a speech to refer to God and so forth and so on, it was too familiar. I didn't consider God to be familiar. I couldn't, Billy Graham and I used to have it out on this several times. Billy used to mention the fact that it was very important for me to emphasize more my Christian background and so forth. And I just never could bring myself to do it. Perhaps it was a mistake. If I had, maybe would have won a close election, but I lost.
The next to religion, the Quakers place a tremendous importance on education. Whittier College, I think, was founded the same year that the town was founded. They built the church and built the college. I think your mother taught you at home before you went to school, and that had a great influence
My
on
mother, as a matter of fact, taught me to read before I ever went to school, and as a result, I skipped one of the early grades, I think the second grade. And also, she influenced me greatly in the whole area of music, because she could play the piano. She wasn't, of course, accomplished like my Aunt Jane or my Uncle Griffith. She was not a teacher, but her influence in those early years was enormous in that respect. As I say, from my father, I got that competitive arguing ability and perhaps a tendency to gesture a bit at time to time. But from my mother, more the dedication to scholarship and an early start. It's just great to have you know, when you stop to think of what a parent can do for a child, and people say, well, get them the best tutors and ship them off here and there and everything. The best thing a parent can do to a child, and Mrs. Nixon does this, Pat does, with our two, spend time with them, spend time with them. And that's carried all down through. Julie spends hours with her two, Jenny and the little boy, and Alex. And Tricia spends hours with Christopher, and as a result, they're very advanced. I think they do that because they know their mother did it and they know their grandmother did it.
Your first musical rendering was Joy to the World.
It certainly was. I can still play it, too. As a matter of fact, I played that by ear. All of my playing now is by ear in the key of G. And I also played in Sunday school, in church on occasion, for many, many years. Reading music, I did not become a good reader of music, but I had a very good memory, and of the classical numbers. Later on, I picked it up in college after I dropped it. See, after I went up to Aunt Jane's in my 7th grade, then in the 8th grade, I was busy with other things, and I didn't continue. And then in college, I didn't, in high school years, I didn't take any music. I played in the orchestra, violin, second violin, not very well. But then in college, a remarkable woman, Margaretha Lohman, a concert pianist, heard me play something from memory that I'd played at some sort of a college function. And she called me Richard, like my mother did, rather than Dick, which all the other kids. She says, Richard, she says, you have a talent here. She says, I want you to take some lessons. She said, you've got to get acquainted with Brahms and Bach. And so I took lessons, and I don't know how I did it in that junior year, because in that year I went out for football. I had the lead in the junior play. I was on the debating team. I did quite well on my studies in that year. I worked at home in the grocery store, went to market every morning and so forth and so on, and yet took lessons. Well, it doesn't show I'm so great, but it does show she was pretty inspirational, because I appreciated Brahms and Bach. In fact, my favorite number, and I've been trying to get Van Cliburn to put it on a record for me, was Brahms' Rhapsody in G, which I can still play little bits of.
We have a film of your mother talking about your early musical prowess. I don't know whether you've seen this before.
No, I haven't. No, I didn't know that. I've never seen that before. It shows my mother must have had a good feeling about politics, that she would allow them to film her talking on the phone. Yeah.
Did you ever consider being a serious musician?
Yes. Oh, yes. Not in the college years, but I think the time I considered is after I finished at Lindsay, when I was 12 years old, and I came back. And then I went to Fullerton High School, and then it really came down to a choice. Where I did play in Fullerton, I did play the violin in the orchestra. It came down to a choice. Would I concentrate on music, or should I move to debating and other areas? And I finally moved in the other direction and didn't pick it up again until I got to college. Sometimes I rather regret it. You regret many things. When I was a kid, I didn't want to be a musician, and I didn't want to be a service station operator or a race car driver or anything else. I want to be an engineer, a railroad engineer. And I remember Everett Barnum used to come on the train from Needles, California. He had to run from Needles to Los Angeles, and the train would go by, and you could hear the whistle at night. And boy, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be a railroad engineer? Not only to run the engines, not so much that, but to see different places and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the music thing, I have always had a feeling that I'd like to be able to express myself in music, to be able to compose it. I've always felt I like organ music, particularly in the great cathedrals of Europe, and in this country as well. And I've always felt how great it would be to be able to play a great organ, and to improvise and compose. And I've also had a sort of a secret yearning to really direct a great symphony orchestra. But all of that's by the boards now. I mean, it never came to pass. Incidentally, I should, well, that's enough.
I would bet you that when these programs are aired, you will get offers from half a dozen cathedrals to give you the key and let you go in and improvise at the keyboards.
Oh, I'm past that point now. I don't have the flexibility in my fingers that I used to have.
You, in the 46 and 50 campaigns...
Incidentally, I should say, incidentally, that as I understand, playing an organ is much more difficult than the piano. It's like the difference between flying an airplane and a helicopter. When you fly an airplane, of course, you use your hand. You fly a helicopter, you got to use your feet and your hands, and the same is true with an organ. So I have a hard enough time doing the piano. I don't think I could do the organ.
If you could, if Zeben Mehta came in and offered you his baton and his orchestra, do you have a piece you would, an orchestral piece that you would choose to conduct?
Well, it would be symphonic without question. Not modern music, not Rhapsody in Blue or any of the, although I like that. None of the musical comedies and so forth. Of course, Beta probably wouldn't ask for those. I would think, and this is sort of in between, that I would like to conduct, for example, a number that always seemed to give me a lift, and that was Victory at Sea, the score from Victory at Sea, which is a great score. And another one is Liszt's Preludes. I have a interesting, it's interesting, but also a little, I think, rather exasperating anecdote about that. I recall that in my second inauguration, they asked me what I wanted them to play, and so I mentioned Liszt's Prelude. The orchestra leader refused. And I said, why did he refuse to play it? They said, because it was one of Hitler's favorites. And I thought, my God. Of course, I knew Wagner was supposed to be too close to Hitler and so forth. I don't much care for Wagnerian music anyway, because I'm not that much of an opera buff. But Beethoven, Hitler liked Beethoven, he liked Wagner, and so forth. Does that mean, and he liked Liszt, does that mean that a great orchestra playing for the inauguration of a president of the United States and want to play it? I thought it was a little bit much.
In the 46 and 50 campaigns, you played the piano. You played fairly often, I think, as a sort of as a technique of campaigning. In those days, people were used to gathering around a piano and singing. Did you want your daughters to learn?
Oh yes.
Did they take lessons?
Well, we went through that. The musical heritage, though, didn't go beyond me. Both Yulie and Tricia like music. Pat naturally wanted to give them opportunity to learn. We bought an accordion for one and gave piano lessons to the other. To Tricia particularly, I remember an incident on that this was about, I would say, 1956. And at that time, she would have been 10 years old, and she was taking piano lessons for the first time. And I was trying to help her one night. And I was telling her, you know, honey, I said the most important thing in learning to play the piano is to practice. I said it's tiring and boring, but if you practice, you can be as good as you want to be. She thought a moment, and she looked at me and said, you know, Daddy, you should have practiced more when you were a little boy. If you had, you might have become famous and have gone to Hollywood, and they would have buried you in a special place.
The Nixon Market was a successful operation added to the service station. One of the things that it specialized in were your mother's pies and cakes. Did you participate in the work of the market?
Well, let me say that not only my mother's pies and cakes, but to show you what competence the old man had. When my mother had to go to Arizona with Harold, who had tuberculosis and spent over 2 years there with him. My dad made the pies and cakes himself, in addition to everything else he was doing. They weren't quite as good as my mother's, but they were good. The only problem that both of them had is that when Christmas came around, they made some excellent mincemeat, but they wouldn't put any brandy in it. One time, Don and I, Don was working the store at that time, we sneaked in a bottle and put some in, and they thought it was the best mincemeat they'd ever made, but they didn't know why. But be that as it may, I remember my mother made those marvelous lemon pies and apple pies, not the kind where you use the apples that are already cooked, but the ones where you slice them in raw and then it bulges up the crust and so forth. Their crusts were fantastic. And great mince pie. And the prices were wonderful too.
What did they cost?
Lemon, 25 cents. Apple, 30 cents. Cherry, 30 cents. Mince, 35 cents. And anyway, she also was very good at cakes. And her specialty, rather than devil's food, was angel's food, which I guess tells us something too. And I remember so well that she had sort of a fetish about it, however. She felt that it was important to get the fresh air into it. And so instead of beating, as you know, with angel food cake, you take the whites of eggs and then you beat them like that. Or now they do it with a mixer. These are the days before mixers, or it was then at least. And I remember my mother in Yorba Linda and later on in Whittier, particularly when she was baking them for the store. She'd stand out on the porch on those cold California mornings, because as you know, it can be very cold in California in the morning. She's beating those egg whites for angel food cake. And believe me, I think they were a little better with that fresh air in them.
Were you a serious child?
Most people think so. That is, those, the psychohistorians say so. But as far as my family is concerned, they say that I studied hard and I worked hard, but that we also had a lot of fun. And we like the garlic story and a few others that you heard about.
Was your mother a disciplinarian as well?
In a very quiet way, yes. But she would do it with a look. If you did something that was wrong, you knew it, and she'd just look at you. Or very quietly, very softly, she would say something. Incidentally, I have something about pies that will interest you. How I mentioned earlier my Aunt Olive, who was so gentle and kind and thoughtful, always of other people's feelings. I remember one family reunion, Aunt Olive had made an apple pie. And we were eating it, and I said, I was just maybe 8 years old at the time. I said, Aunt Olive, says, this is even better than Mother's. Aunt Olive didn't say anything at the moment. My mother says, that's right, Olive, it certainly is. Later on, Aunt Olive took me aside, and she said, Richard, just remember, nobody makes better pies than your mother. And it was a lesson I never forgot. Here I was, of course, trying to praise her, but not sensitive to the fact that in praising her, it might have been something my mother wouldn't appreciate. Although my mother, of course, was so big that she sort of laughed about it.
Thinking about apple pies, I remember once you mentioned how you were, thinking back to your mother's apple pies, how you were impressed with a film. Was it Waterloo Bridge?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I mentioned that to Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart in Waterloo Bridge. I mentioned it to him about 7 years ago when I was at Chasen's restaurant in Los Angeles, and he was there with his wife, Gloria. And I went over to the table before leaving and paid my respects. And I said, you know, you've made so many movies, but I remember Waterloo Bridge. And I remember particularly there was a moment when you were talking to this girl who was sort of a woman of fortune, and you were trying to tell her what you thought of her. And what you said was that you compared her and your feeling toward her with the way you felt about your mother and her apple pies. She said, my mother made great apple pie. And she said, after she died, I've never liked apple pie since, because there was nothing to compare with it. It was something like that, but Jimmy remembered. He appreciated the fact that it had an impact.
I read a story about your mother at the store, or at the time of the store, that you had taken some grapes from a nearby arbor, and she...
As a matter of fact, that occurred earlier. When we were in Yorba Linda, which was a very small town. Everybody knew everybody else, of course, and one of our closest neighbors was Mrs. Trueblood. Incidentally, a great Quaker name, as you know. And Mrs. Trueblood was a very kind lady and a very good friend of my mother's. And one day, my brother and I think it was Don and I, we were over playing near the Truebloods, and the Concord grapes were just come in, and they were beautiful. And so we took some, we ate them. And we got home, why, of course, those Concord grape was all over our face, and my mother said, where did you get those? What happened? And we said, we got them at Mrs. Trueblood's. She said, no, you should not have done that. And she gave each of us 5 cents, and he said, you take that over and give it to Mrs. Trueblood. Well, I remember we gave the 5 cents to Mrs. Trueblood, and she didn't want to take it, and I could see, I remember even to this day, she seemed to have tears in her eyes. But of course she had to take it, but we never forgot that. We didn't get any more grapes, and we didn't take any more there or anyplace else.
During the time of the store, your father, which is surprising in a man who was as tough a dealer as he, was burned by some tire buyers.
Oh, yes. Once, but never again. You have to understand that we were operating in the store in the years just before the Depression and during Depression. And it was on a very close margin. And because of the illness in our family, our budget was pretty tight. And so therefore, we had to be concerned about any losses that might occur. But one of the biggest profit items in the service station was tires. And incidentally, when I give you these figures, it's to show you that tires is one of the few items in America that has not gone up in price. Because on this occasion, a fellow came along one day. He was in a big car. It was a big Buick, as I recall, and he had 3 children and his wife with him, and he needed 2 tires. And so he picked up 2 of the best tires that we had. It cost $67 for 2 tires. And so the old man changed the tires, put them back on the wheels and so forth. And the fellow was very impressive looking, gave him a check for him for $67. And my father was so appreciative of making this very big sale, where you'd make a profit of about $10 on the 67, that he gave each of those children, I remember, a candy bar. And then so they drove off. 2 days later, the check bounced. And I must say that my mother and father, I heard them talking about it at the dinner table. They couldn't understand how that could have happened. But from then on, in my father's place, unless he knew the people, it was cash and carry. Although we did have credit, let me say, and a lot of people never paid the bills, and we didn't press them too hard either.
This was a time when a lot of important historical things were happening in the outside world, at any rate. Do you have any memory of the First World War or its impact on the town?
Well, the First World War, I have a vivid memory of when it ended, of Armistice Day. Now, you understand, I was only then 5 years old, but I can remember this day. We lived in Yorba Linda then. We went over to Placentia. They were going to have a parade. The American Legion had a parade. And I remember they had an effigy of the Kaiser hanging on one of the floats. And I thought it was the real Kaiser, that they had him hanging there.
Do you remember getting the first radio?
Oh, very well. As a matter of fact, it was called a Gilfillan. I don't know that they even make it anymore. It's a great big thing. It's like, as a matter of fact, when I went to Russia and to China, I saw these huge radios, which of course before you get miniaturization is the way it was. And it reminded me of that old Gilfillan radio. And the reason my parents got it, however, was not for the music, but they got it for the religious programs. They loved listening to Amy McPherson and Bob Schuller and the great evangelists on the radio. And so they got this, they made the expenditure for that. But I remember radio even before we got that fancy one. My brother Harold was very good on mechanical things too, and we got a crystal set. And you know, you take that and you did various things. I don't know, he was better at it than I was, and we used to tune in on things on the crystal set, including a boxing match now and then. How things have changed. But as let me say, not having radio and not having television was not all that bad, because we made up for that in conversation and in reading. And so consequently, I've always said, and fortunately Pat totally agrees with me, and both Trish and Julie did, limit people on TV. Because you miss so much if you miss reading and conversation. People just don't do that anymore. They don't know how to talk.
What did you read as a child?
Well, we had access to a Wonder World set. It was sort of I suppose, a children's encyclopedia. And I remembered particularly that I was interested in the history, I was in the Greek mythology and that sort of thing. We also had a book, I remember a book that we had of, which I think my father gave to me, of the great heroes of early America. And I remember Mad Anthony Wayne and Nathaniel Greene, who was the Quaker who fought in the Revolutionary Wars. Those stick in mind. But I read those stories over and over again. And then there were magazines, the Ladies' Home Journal, which my mother took, the Saturday Evening Post, and the National Geographic, which we didn't take, but which the Marshburns, my Uncle Oscar and Olive took, and I used to go up there and borrow it. I've learned since, of course, never loan it because they seldom come back, but I love to turn through that pages of that magazine and think of the far-off places I wanted to go. Well, the other thing we read was the Bible. And I don't say this simply because it's expected to be said, but the Bible is not just a great book, it's a great collection of books. I remember one who was not particularly religious of my college professors, Albert Upton, as a matter of fact. I think he was an agnostic. But he once said to me, the greatest book ever written was Ecclesiastes. And it is a great book, and you can read it today, and the profundity of it. And I don't think that we missed a thing by not having quite as much to read, but having higher quality. So I read the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then, of course, anything else that happened to come out. It wasn't too much, but what we had was pretty good.
Counting as one of the major historical events at the time, from your point of view, must have been your first baseball game.
Oh, I remember that very well. Shorty Hedges, neighbor, and I, and classmate, when I was about 12 years old, we took the streetcar, the big red car they called them, Pacific Electric, over to L.A., Los Angeles, to see a baseball game at Wrigley Field. That was when the Los Angeles Angels was a minor league, a double-A, but minor league. And they were playing the San Francisco Seals in a doubleheader. I don't remember much about it except that I remember that the Angels catcher was named Truck Hanna. He was a great catcher, and he could hit, but he couldn't run. And so he never made the major leagues. And the pitcher that day, and this I remember very well because he won the game, was Charlie Root, who pitched for the Angels and later went up to the Cubs, and he was the one that threw the gopher ball to Babe Ruth. When Babe Ruth pointed and then hit it over the fence, Charlie Root was the pitcher, and I followed that. I followed, incidentally, sports. We spoke of what I read. We read the newspapers. I read newspapers from a very, very early age. We took the Los Angeles Times, and it was delivered in Yorba Linda and later in Whittier, and I used to read it from cover to cover. And I used to really read the sports pages, and I can tell you about virtually everything in sports, from Big Bill Tilden in tennis to the Olympic stars to the basketball, et cetera, et cetera. But getting onto this baseball game, while I remember the games, and I remember that the Angels, I think, split the two games, what I particularly remember is the hot dogs. And Shorty and I bought hot dogs, and each of us, you get them for 10 cents each, and we each had $1 to spend. We each had 6. And the guy came around at the last, the place wasn't sold out, and he had 2 left, and he says, "Look, I'll give you these for $0.05 apiece." Shorty said, "No way, I don't have room." And so, though it was a bargain, that was one time we didn't take it.
This was the time, and you've subsequently written about the sadness of it, that your brother Arthur died. You had just come back from being with Aunt Jane in Lindsay, I believe, and he developed a headache that...
Well, from this picture, you can see he was a very, very handsome fellow, young fellow. He was 5 years younger than I, and he was, of course, the favorite of the family. We had a very close tie. As a matter of fact, I remember when he came up with my mother and father and Don to pick me up at Lindsay. They drove up there. And when he got out of the car and saw me, he ran to me and he kissed me rather quietly and not too much notice on the cheek. Later, my mother said that on the way up, he had asked her, "Would it be all right if I kiss Richard on the cheek?" And she said, "Okay," which of course is another indication of the way that we are quite proud. As a matter of fact, I've taken a lot of heat from many of the people, many of my female supporters and non-supporters and critics, because I just don't believe in the public kissing. It's very difficult. I don't mind bussing somebody on the forehead or the cheek and so forth, but we just don't do it. I don't mind if others do it. It doesn't bother me a bit. But with Pat, as you note, and so forth, it's just a sense of privacy. It's just something we didn't do. We didn't grow up with it. Anyway, we came on down. We came on down from Lindsay, and after we got back, Arthur complained of a headache. Incidentally, in retrospect, we might have guessed that it might have been because of cigarettes, because he had a mind of his own. And I remember when, about 2 years before that, when he's 5 years old, he got a package of cigarettes out of the store, and he took it out in the back of the store, and he proceeded to smoke one of them. And a nosy neighbor reported to my mother, and I must say I didn't much care about that, or her since. But anyway, it wasn't cigarettes this time. It turned out to be tubercular meningitis. Nothing could be done about it. Absolutely nothing. And so I recall so well the days before he died. And I recall particularly, you hear of my father, this tough, rough, diamond in the rough. I never forget it after the doctor, Dr. Wilson from Whittier, had gone up and diagnosed the case after they'd make a spinal tap and found that it was tubercular meningitis and said that there was no hope. He came down the stairs, and my father said, "They say," he was crying uncontrollably, he says, "they say the little darling's going to die." Well, anyway, we then 2 days after that, a couple of days after the doctor did it, gave that prognosis, we went up to see him, and he was awake. He'd come out of a coma, and he asked his mother if he couldn't have some tomato gravy. He liked tomato gravy on toast, and so they hadn't let him eat much, and so I remember she brought it up to him, and he had that. And then shortly thereafter, he just went to sleep, and so that was the end.
Some years later, when you were in college, you wrote an essay about your brother, about Arthur, that your mother kept, and the essay opened with a reference to the picture, and that was always kept in the sitting room. And I wonder if you could read some of it, from some of it.
All right. I'll have to put my glasses on for that.
When this was written in about 1930, as a or just before as a high school composition exercise.
This was written in 1930. Written in 1930 when I was a freshman in college. Written for freshman English, I remember. Well, it isn't great literature, but perhaps it indicates how that particular event affected all of us. I was describing him. I remember how his eyes changed from their original baby blue to an almost black shade, and how his hair, blonde at first, became dark brown, and how his mouth, toothless for 5 months, was filled with tiny white teeth, which, by the way, were exceedingly sharp when applied on soft fingers or toes which happened to get within their reach, and how those little coherent, incoherent sounds of his finally developed into words and then into sentences, how he learned to roll over and then to crawl and finally to walk. Although I do not remember many incidents connected with my brother's early childhood, there were some which made a clear imprint on my mind. There was one time when he was asked to be a ring bearer at a wedding. I remember how my mother had to work with him for hours to get him to do it because he disliked walking with a little flower girl. Another time when he's about 5 years old, he showed the world that he was a man by getting some cigarettes out of our store and secretly smoking them back of the house. Unfortunately for him, one of our gossipy neighbors happened to see him, and she promptly informed my mother. I have disliked that neighbor from that time. And again, I shall never forget how he disliked wearing sticky, woolly suits. As soon as he was able to read, he used to search the mail order catalogs for suits which weren't sticky. There's a grave now out in the hills, but like the picture, it contains only the bodily image of my brother. And so when I'm tired and worried and I'm almost ready to quit trying to live as I should, I look up, I see the picture of a little boy with sparkling eyes and curly hair. I remember the childlike prayer. I pray that it may prove true for me as I did for my brother Arthur. The prayer I was referring to was just before he died, or the day before he died, and went into the final coma. He had my mother come to the bed, and he said, I want to say my prayers. And the prayer, of course, is the very well-known one, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And then that was the last words he ever spoke.
You started school, or started high school in 1926.
Right.
What kind of a student were you?
I was a pretty good student, not because I was with any inherited genius, but I worked hard, and I was very good in Latin. I had 4 years of straight A's. Perhaps a lot of help from my mother in that. I was very good in English, very good in history. They were easy for me. And I had, however, great difficulty with math and science, but I managed to do them well because it's always been my theory in life that the real test of a person is not how you do the things you like well, but how you do the things you don't like well. Not how well you do the easy things, but how well you do the tough things. And so whenever I had something in math or science that was real tough, to me it was a challenge, and I'd work harder on that than I would on, like, my English composition, which was like falling off a log for me.
You once told a story about a geometry problem that if you got the answer to the problem, you didn't. It gave you an A for the course.
Yes, the teacher was Miss Ernsberger. She was, as I recall, and she was very good, a German background, and she gave us the challenge. This is a very difficult geometric problem, and she said, "Did anyone that got the answer to that problem. We get an A for the course. Well, I took it home, and I worked all night. I remember it was a very, very cold night because I came downstairs from the upstairs bedroom where we were sleeping, and came down to the kitchen and sat at the kitchen table. I lit the fire in the stove, which was a gas stove, opened it up, the oven, so as to heat the room. And just as the dawn came up, I got the answer, and I got the A. I haven't the slightest idea, as I recall, what it was about, but I got an A for the course, but it was because of an all-night vigil.
You were active in debate and dramatics in school, I know, in sports. In dramatics, I think you made a very impressive dramatic debut.
Well, in retrospect, my first dramatic appearance should really have been my last, because it was an almost unbelievably horrendous experience. I mentioned the fact that I was fairly proficient in Latin, and at Whittier High School, which had a very strong Latin department. In fact, it was a requirement at Whittier, no longer, but was then, for graduation, for those that wanted to go to college. But in any event, in this particular year, it was my senior year, the Latin play, not in Latin but in English, was the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, which of course we had studied. It's the fourth-year Latin course in most high schools, was then at least. And I played the part of Aeneas, and my girlfriend, Ola Florence Welch, played the part of Dido. Well, it was quite an experience in two different ways. First, at one point, a very dramatic moment, the script calls for Aeneas and Dido to embrace. In fact, it calls for Aeneas to kiss Dido. I wouldn't do that, but at least we agreed that we would embrace. And I'll never forget, and I threw my arms around Dido, i.e. Ola Florence, the hoots and the catcalls and the whistles from all the kids out there, and we both turned red and got through the play. But what was really made it worse was that I was in excruciating pain. I had they rented costumes, and I had to have silver boots. And they came in from the costume people. I was only about 5'9" at that time. I didn't get up to my 5'11" until I got to college. But in any event, they must have thought, they figured, tried to guess what my shoe size was. They didn't realize my feet were already 11D, which they are today, which is pretty big, even for one who's 5'11". So they had a 5'9" boot. Well, it took 2 Latin teachers and the school janitor to get them on me. And I walked around that stage, and every step was the most excruciating experience. And let me say this, I've never worn boots since. I'm just thinking, I have at least 10 pairs of boots have been given to me in my campaigns. Campaigns in Texas in 52, 56, 1960, again in 1968 and 1972. And I've given them all away. I can't stand boots because I remember the horror of having to wear boots in that play.
You were also very active and very successful in debate at this time, and I think or I've heard you say that the teacher who taught you a natural sense of speaking, or natural style of speaking, as opposed to the rather florid type that was popular at the time, accounted for a lot of your subsequent success in debate and in politics.
I remember his name very well. H. Lynn Schuller, he was called. Many didn't like him because he was a very tough grader. But I have found, incidentally, that my best teachers, in retrospect, were those who were toughest on me. I remember, for example, that my teacher of history, Jenny Levin, was awfully tough grader in U.S. history. So tough, as a matter of fact, the parents complained so much, they made her teach study hall, which was a great loss. But in any event, I can remember that H. Lynn Schuller would have been great in today's television age, I think, because he would have told people what they need to hear, and that is be yourself, be natural. Those were the days when there were oratorical contests, and I won quite a few of them, when you had automatic gestures, you know, and great flights of oratory and so forth. But Schuller used to say over and over again, remember, speaking is conversation. If you have an audience, you may raise the level of your voice, but don't shout at people. Talk to them, converse with them. And so I have used, to the greatest extent possible, the conversational tone ever since, and I think it's particularly suited for television.